All right, we'll start the Striped Bass Board meeting. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Atlantic Striped Bass Management Board meeting. My name is Marty Gary. I'm your chair with the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. Our vice chair for this board is Megan Ware from the state of Maine, and I'm joined by staff members from ASMFC, Emily Franca, seated to my right, and also our ASMFC science lead, Dr. Katie Drew. Before we get started, just a few announcements. I know the New Jersey DEP folks are going to get a lot of accolades over the next few days, but I'll start it if, or maybe I'm second or third in line here, but want to thank Joe Cimino and all of his staff, Mike and Jeff and Heather and everybody for putting on a great show and getting us settled here in Long Branch, New Jersey, a beautiful setting. And if any of you were lucky enough to see the site this morning, it was pretty impressive to wake up to in a textbook predator-prey relationship. Huge amounts of menhaden along the beach with stripers working on them, a humpback whale, and certainly a whole bunch of charter boat and fishing vessels. The only thing I think that was missing, I was looking for Joe and a trident, you know, as he summoned all this to come together. Pretty impressive. So Joe, thanks for all your hard work and all your staff for putting this together. We have a couple new commissioners here, not new faces, but new in their seats. Doug Grout is here as a governor's appointee for New Hampshire. Doug, welcome back. You replaced Richie White. It's hard to believe we're not going to see Richie White around this table. But I will say the Granite State loses nothing in intellectual and experiential prowess. So we welcome you back to work with the board here. And then also welcome back to Adam Nowalski for New Jersey. Adam is going to be at the table as proxy for New Jersey's new legislative commissioner, Senator Vin Gopal. And I was going to say, Adam, I have to say I personally missed you not being here to not miss the things that I miss. So if everybody knows you, you don't miss anything. So thank you for all your hard work, and we welcome you back. Also seated to my left is Sergeant Jeff Mercer from Rhode Island, and he will be taking over at the Law Enforcement Committee for Striped Bass. So welcome, Jeff. And he'll be replacing Kurt Blanchard. And Kurt, if you could raise your hand. Hopefully Kurt's still in the room. He's in the back. Kurt, thank you so much for all your help. Thank you, Kurt, for all your good work with this species over the years. Much appreciated. All right, so we'll move on with our agenda. Number 2, board consent. So we'll first order of business is the approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or modifications to the agenda? Joe Cimino.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. No, I just wanted to say thank you for that. And I just would be remiss. We can't accept all those kudos. ASMFC staff has just done so much. So the thanks really belong to Laura and the Lisas and Tina. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and absolutely right on the kudos to the ASMFC staff. So thanks to all of them. All right, so if there are no objections to the agenda as presented, we'll approve that by consent. And on to our next item, which is approval of the proceedings from August 2022. Are there any edits to those proceedings? Seeing none, we'll approve those proceedings by consent. Next up is public comment for items that are not on the agenda. We'll entertain comments for those items not on the agenda from those folks in the room. So we'll look for a show of hands, and also online. And I think, Katie, you have those if you see somebody, or Megan, you have that? I'm sorry, Emily. No hands online. Is there anyone that would like to make a comment that's in attendance? Doesn't appear to be any, so we'll move on. Item number 4 on the agenda is consideration of the 2022 Atlantic Striped Bass Stock Assessment Update. So we'll have a presentation of the stock assessment report. Dr. Gary Nelson from Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries is the lead analyst for the Striped Bass Stock Assessment. He is joining us virtually on the webinar and will present the 2022 Stock Assessment Update. Is Gary prepared?
Yes, we are pulling his presentation up on the screen right now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting the results of the updated stock assessment, which we completed this past August, I believe. And I will be going through each of the terms of reference that were assigned to us during the update. All right, for the first, terms of reference one, we were required to update all the fisheries dependent data that were included in the last benchmark. We did that by updating all of the commercial and recreational data for 2018 to 2021. These were included in the assessment. The recreational harvest and releases, the latter used to calculate the dead releases, were obtained from for each state via the MRIP website. The commercial harvest data were reported by the individual states, and as we did in the benchmark and with the new improved method, we estimated commercial discards using tag data and MRIP estimates. And again, that method was approved in the benchmark. It's a kind of complicated method, so I won't get into it. Just as a reminder, there's actually some missing data sources which we have no information on. We have no harvest or release data from major rivers like the Hudson River, the Delaware River. And of course, we really have no estimates of the amount of poaching that does take place. So those numbers are lacking from the assembly of the catch data. This slide just shows the total removals in millions of fish taken in Chesapeake Bay and the ocean region. And the ocean region includes all areas outside of Chesapeake Bay. And this is the time series since 1982. If you look at the red, vertical red dashed line, that indicates the separation between 2017 and 2018. And you can see that the landings after 2017 have been declining a bit. The total landings have pretty much dropped and kind of leveled out in 2021. The region with the highest removals is the ocean region compared to Chesapeake Bay. This slide just shows the total removals by disposition category. Recreational harvest is here in pink. Recreational dead releases are in blue. Commercial harvest is in yellow, and the commercial dead discards are in black. As you can see, recreational harvest and dead releases comprise most of the removals over the time series. And in 2021, the recreational harvest and dead releases comprise about 86% of the total removals. This slide shows the age composition of the total removals from 2012 in the upper left-hand corner to 2021 down in the lower right-hand corner. Age is on the x-axis here, or the bottom axis. The strong year classes witnessed over time are represented in different colors. We have the 2011 year class here in yellow, and you can see starting in 2012, 2011 year class from Chesapeake Bay entered the fishery and progressed. You can see the landings progressing through time. They were a strong age component of the total landings, total removals during these time periods, and then since like 2019, 2020, the contribution of that large year class has waned over time. We also show here in blue the 2014 year class out of the Hudson, and that's in blue, and then also the 2015 year class that entered the fishery in 2016, and you can see that progressing through time, where currently it is one of the major contributors to the total removals. We also have plotted The average, about average 2018 year class here in green, you can see that starting to come into the population too. So this just shows you what ages were comprised the total removals. So we also were charged with updating all the fisheries independent data that were used in the previous peer review benchmark stock assessment. So we'll be showing you that. Let me just back up. So what we did was we updated all the younger the year indices, the age specific indices. We had surveys with complete age composition data, and all of these, the information here is used in the stock assessment and to help tune the model to determine fishery mortality and spawning stock biomass. So this table just shows a pattern of how some of the surveys were impacted during COVID and also for other reasons. During the period 2018 to 2021, during COVID, during year 2020, New York's age 1 survey was delayed a bit and getting started. The New Jersey's Young of the Year Index sampling did not occur during 2020. Getting to some of the age composition surveys down below, the Connecticut trawl survey did not occur in 2020. Neither did the New Jersey trawl, but it also hasn't, it wasn't conducted in 2019 and 21, I think due to boat issues or something like that. And then the Delaware spawning stock electrofishing survey did not occur in 2020. The Maryland gillnet spawning stock survey was interrupted, I think shortened in 2021 for reasons I don't remember. And the CHESMAP index from the CHESMAP survey was not provided because they switch vessels and they're running calibration studies so that the studies prior to the index prior to 2019 can be compared to what happened in the past. Just to point out, these are the Young of the Year indices, and just point out a few features. Shown in this slide are the Young of the Year and Age 1 survey indices from the Hudson River, Delaware Bay. Where is it? Where's Delaware Bay? Oh, right here. And Chesapeake Bay, and as well as the Maryland Virginia Composite Index, which we use now as the primary Chesapeake Bay Young of the Year Index in the assessment. And this is a modeling approach where we combine the Maryland and the juvenile and Virginia juvenile indices. The Young of the Year Index for New York showed a bit of a decline relative to 2008. Wait a minute, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide. The New Jersey, we had a peak in 2020 here and a drop in 2021. 2020, we still wonder whether this big peak here is either a strong year class coming out of the Hudson, or it could have been due to the effect of that delay or later time period in which the survey was conducted. The Virginia index here shows very lack of strong year classes in the later time period, in a lower one in 2021. The Maryland in the lower left-hand corner, again, we all know what's going on there. We have very low recruitment indicated by that index. And in New Jersey's Delaware Bay index, they missed 2020, but the 2021 value has dropped to a fairly low value. And if we look at the composite up in the left-hand corner, this is the Maryland and Virginia index. We can see that the combined index is saying that recruitment has been declining since about 2017, 18, around there. All right. These are for the age 1 fishes, the Maryland age 1 and the New York age 1. The Maryland is indicated here with the circles showing the strong 2015 and 18, strong 2015 and average 2018 year classes. And in New York age 1, we can see that big 2014 year class indicated here. But in recent years, it's getting lower. Recruitment appears to be lower. This map just shows the total index for these age surveys with complete age compositions. Again, ChesMap only provided one data point from 2018, because from 2019 on they switched vessels. So we can't really say much about what's going on in the latter, in the nearest years. Maryland's spawning stock gillnet surveys always been kind of flat and variable through time. The Delaware 30-foot trawl survey has been kind of flat since the mid-2000s. Delaware's spawning stock electrofishing survey showed their indexes actually in the latter 5 or 6 years has been lower than in the former part of the time series. New Jersey trawl, we didn't have any information, again, for various reasons. The New York Ocean Hull survey is stopped in 2006, but we still use it in the assessment. And the index from the Connecticut trawl survey was missing 2020, but in the 2021 value appears to be lower than in the previous years also. And then the MRIP catch per unit effort index that we developed, excuse me, has been declining a little bit in the last few years. So for Tour 3, we were assigned to tabulate or list the life history information using in the assessment and a model parameterization and note any differences from the benchmark. So just to refresh your memory about the 2018 benchmark, we use a forward projecting statistical catch at age model, which estimates age 1 abundance in each year. It estimates fully recruited F in each year. It estimates catchability for catchability. This should be selectivity. Yeah, catch selectivity, sorry. Catch selectivity in 4 regulatory periods. There's a catchability coefficient estimated for all indices. There's selectivity estimated for each of the 8 age composition surveys. And the data are split into 2 fleets, as we mentioned before, the ocean and the Bay region. And this because we improved the selectivity fits and some of the partial provides partial Fs for each of those regions. And we had used age-specific Ms, which we had developed from various methods. So to update, we used the same life history parameters, the natural mortality, maturity at age. We updated the weights at age for use in the spawning stock biomass calculations. We added a new selectivity block for 2020 and 21 because of all the regulatory changes that went into effect in 2020, where there was some major changes in size limits. So we thought it was best to provide, to start a new selectivity block. And during the exploratory analyses, we tried to figure out what shape the new selectivity blocks, the selectivity pattern would be in these blocks. And so we explored providing a 4-parameter double logistic equation that can produce both flat top and dome shade selectivity. And the result was that the dome shape was needed in Chesapeake Bay, but a flat top was still was evident for the ocean. However, because of the size changes, the selectivity slid down to younger ages. And as part of the update, we also adjust the CVs. These are just some statistical things we do. We adjust the CVs for the surveys and to get a residual mean square error around 1. And then we also adjust the effective sample size of the survey age composition data using Francis's method. Tour 4 was to update accepted model and estimate uncertainty, conduct retrospective analyses, include some sensitivity runs, and compare the benchmark assessments with the results from the current assessment. So our model, again, we updated the model. And we have new selectivity period for both the bay and ocean, and that was the model approved by the TC, and so that is considered our base model. So these are results from our base model. So shown here are the estimates of fully recruited fishing mortality for the bay, which is in the lower gray line, and the ocean which is the upper gray line, and the total fishing mortality is in the red here. The highest fishing mortality generally occurred in the ocean region, and all of the regions showed a decline in NAFTA after 2017. The fully recruited F in 2021 was 0.5 in the ocean and 0.5 in the bay and 0.1 in the ocean. And the total fishing mortality, excuse me, total fishing mortality that we use in stock determination was estimated to be 0.136. And if you look at the graph, you can see there's been a tremendous decline in fishing mortality since after 2017. So the regulations have done its job. Let's see. Okay, this slide just shows the estimates of recruitment for the model. Remember, this is a combined stock model, so even though Chesapeake Bay influences catch influences a lot of the components and the estimates in the model, we also have Delaware and also Hudson River fish in here too. So you can see I just pointed out some of the past strong year classes, 2011, 2015, and that average year class 2018, and in the last couple of years it's been lower, estimated to be lower. This slide just shows the estimates of abundance coming from the model. Age 1 plus abundance, which is age 1 through 15, is shown here in the gray, and you can see that increase over time, but has declined after about 2003 or 4, and has kind of jumped around. And that's simply because recruitment is outweighing, overshadows most of the other ages. But if we break it down into just age 8 plus fish, you can see again there was a big increase up to about 2003 or 4, some bouncing around, and then since about 2011, the numbers of 8 plus fish have declined. And these are the estimates of female spawning stock biomass in metric tons that comes from the model. Kind of similar pattern to the numbers. We were peaking about 2003 or 4, some bouncing around, and then after about 2010 or 11, it has declined. And the current model estimates suggest that it's actually been increasing over the last few years. And that's probably due to the 2015 year class starting to move into the reproductively active part of the population. We were asked to do retrospective analyses on the model, and what a retrospective analysis allows allows you to observe the impact of parameter estimation with the addition of another year's worth of data. So the way it works is that the current model estimates are compared to the estimates that would occur when the current year's data are deleted. And we do this essentially 7 times. So what you're seeing here on the left are the actual estimates from each model run in which the current year is deleted. So we start at 2021 and delete and repeat each model by deleting the next year and next year and next year. And it gives you a sense of how stable the estimates are. So the top is, excuse me, the fully recruited F, and the bottom is female spawning stock biomass. Not too bad as in terms of stability of the estimates for fishing mortality. If we look at female spawning stock biomass, you get a more sense that we're slightly overestimating the female spawning stock biomass now. And on the right are actually the retrospective plots where you can see for most of the time series up top is fishing mortality. We slightly overestimated fishing mortality, but in the more recent years we're underestimating slightly fishing mortality. On average it's about 10% or so. And below is the retrospective for 7 peels for the female spawning stock biomass. And you can see here that we're actually slightly overestimating the female spawning biomass now. In the past, the last assessment, benchmark assessments, it was kind of the other way. The spawning stock biomass actually was usually underestimated, but that underestimation was becoming less as we were approaching the 2017, using the 2017 data. However, with the addition of the 2018 through 21, that pattern changed a bit with those data, but it also changed because of a slight change in weightings that occurred this time around with when we used the methods to reweight the data, the new data. So it's so it definitely has changed. So that was a issue we all discussed during the TC and stock assessment meetings. So since there is a slight systematic bias in the 2021 SSB and fishing mortality estimates due to the which we identified through the retrospective, we investigated whether our terminal estimates should be adjusted for that bias. So what we did was use the National Marine Fisheries method of doing so, and in this method, what happens is that there's a statistic called the Mons Row, which is calculated essentially the average of the proportional differences between the retrospective peels, and we use seven peels. Those values are then used to adjust the terminal F and the SSB values. And in this graph here, the black value is a bivariate plot of the fishing mortality on the left versus the female SSB, and the black value circle here is the 2021 values. So we adjust the terminal F and SSB using the Mons Row, and this red value is what that adjustment would be. If the adjusted values are outside the by 90% bivariate confidence interval here, which are these lines coming up from the original estimate, then adjustment is desired. However, if the adjusted values are within the confidence intervals, then correction isn't required, and that's kind of a rule that the National Marine Fisheries Service developed, and I couldn't explain completely how they got there, but that's been a standard that's been adopted, so we adopted that here. So based on this comparison here, the resulting values did not have to be adjusted in any way, so we'll just use the values that were produced in the model. So so we did a number of sensitivity runs. We ran a sensitivity analysis to examine the impact, potential impact of the delay in sampling that occurred for the New York Age 1 index, and that the shortened season in the Maryland spawning stock survey. And we looked at the impact by essentially removing those points from the assessment model and re-estimating everything, and then comparing the estimates from the models. And you can see here on the left of the estimates of fishing mortality for both models, which you can't see because they lay right over each other. So top is fishing mortality, middle is female spawning stock biomass, and bottom is the age 1 recruits. The only slight difference that occurred was in the 2019 value, and if you look over to the right, which just shows the percent differences in the estimates between the two models, there was a slight change between the base and the model, with the points deleted, and it was essentially the current model estimates the recruitment about 10% higher than the models without those data points. So it really wasn't much impact at all, so we weren't worried about it. We also examined other configurations for the selectivity blocks in the 2020 and 21 period. We ran two scenarios to explore resulting changes to our model. So in the first scenario, a selectivity block was used only in the ocean region, and in these graphs, the ocean only region will be in red here with the triangle. And in the second scenario, we just continued using the same selectivity blocks as we used in the benchmark, which essentially the last block range went from 1996 up to 2017. That was one time block. So these graphs just compare the changes in the fishing mortality and SSB. The resulting fishing mortality in SSB for the ocean-only stock, actually, ocean-only selectivity block, came up almost about the same as our base model, which you can see here in the red. The base model is in the black. That's fishing mortality. And the estimates was just slightly lower for SSB. They were just slightly lower than the base model. Assuming no changes in selectivity, the estimates were a lot higher in the orange here up above than the current base model, and the SSB actually declined a bit compared to the base model. And this slide just shows a comparison of the fishing mortality and spawning stock biomass between the benchmark and the 2022 update. You can see up the top is fishing mortality. They pretty much agreed up until we got near the terminal years in the benchmark, but now the model is estimating a higher fishing mortality at particular years, so that it did change a little bit. And at the bottom is female SSB, showing that during the early parts of the time series, the new model is slightly underestimating SSB compared to the benchmark. Pretty close during the middle, and now it's underestimating I wouldn't say underestimating, it's lower than the benchmark produced in 2018. So there's some changes. So term of reference 5 was to update the biological reference point for the stock and determine stock status. And because of that, we're in the low recruitment period, all the reference points that I'll be showing were developed using the low recruitment regime, which are pretty much using the recruitment estimates from 2008 to 2021. Those represents our low recruitment regime. So the female spawning stock biomass reference points are essentially determined from the estimates that come out of the stock assessment. And the threshold is the 1995 spawning stock biomass value. And in the model, it was estimated to be 85,800 metric tons. And our SSB calculation is just taking 125% of the threshold. And that estimate is 106,800 metric tons. Whoops. So the way we come up with the fishing mortality associated with those thresholds and targets is we use, we use a stochastic projection model. This is parameterized with the estimates of abundance at age and associated errors from the model estimate ending in year 2021. We use an average selectivity after 2021 in the projection. We project 100 years in the future, and we do that 10,000 times. And during each time, we're randomly drawing recruit age 1 estimates from, again, from the 2008 to 2021 low recruitment regime. And essentially, in this model, you adjust, we have an F that you adjust, and you adjust that until the median spawning stock biomass at the end of 100 years equals our SSB threshold and SSB target estimated from the stock assessment model. And those, the Fs associated with the threshold came out to be 0.20, and the F target was 0.17, which are pretty close to the, if I remember correctly, pretty close to the threshold, F threshold and target that we had in the benchmark. If we overlay these values onto the female SSB and fishing mortality plots, on the left here, the red solid line is the SSB threshold and the upper dashed line SSB target. If you compare the estimates of female spawning stock biomass, they're all below those reference points, and so the stock is determined to be overfished. If we look at the fully recruited fishing mortality below, however, the current fishing mortality is estimated to be below both the F and the F target and F threshold values, so we can conclude that overfishing is not occurring. We were also asked to do short-term projections. This was TOR 6. And so what people were interested in is to determine the probability of reaching the target by 2029 under the low recruitment regime. And so we essentially projected the population using the same starting values that we did to determine the reference point, same values starting in 2021. And we sampled from the low recruitment data under the assuming that the current F remain constant over the time period. That would be in the upper graph here. The middle graph is assuming that we fished at the target over after 2021, and then at the bottom is fishing at the threshold after 2021. The red triangles here, the median of the 10,000 replicates of the projection, and the upper, and then shown here in the dash, the upper and lower 2.5 and 97.5 percentiles. And the target and thresholds are the dashed lines, the threshold value, and the solid, what do they call that? That line, dashed line, as opposed to dotted line, is the target. Under the current, if we can maintain F at the current level, it's projected that the target would be, SSB would be reached by around 2025. And by 2029, there is a 96.5%. Oh, wait a minute, is that the right one? Yeah, 78.6% probability that the SSB has exceeded the target value. And by that time, too, close to almost 100% that the SSB will be above the threshold. As we increase the fishing mortality to the target at 0.1677, we do reach the target value by 2029, and the probability of being above the target is about 52% or so, and about 82% being above the threshold. And then if we fish at the threshold value, the SSB increases a little bit, but then tapers out and starts coming closer to the threshold. And so by 2029, there's only 30% chance it's above the target, and 59% chance or so that it's above the threshold. So in conclusion, the stock is overfished, but overfishing is not occurring, and this is relative to the new low recruitment F reference points. And so there is a 78.6% chance that the stock will be at or above the SSB target in 2029 under the current F. So based on these results, there seems to be no further reductions needed at the time. And just to mention some sources of uncertainty is that the 2020 and 21 data are more uncertain because of COVID-19. The retrospective pattern has changed directions a bit, and we're now underestimating F and overestimating SSB. We only have 2 years of data for which to estimate the new selectivity block, so that could change a little bit. At least the patterns in selectivity, or the shape, I should say, might change a little bit when more years of data are added. So that's it for me.
Good. All right. Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. At this time, we'll take questions for Dr. Nelson. And just a reminder, we do have 2 board members participating online. So Katie and Emily will be taking a look to see if they raise their hands. So questions for Dr. Nelson. Start with Jason, Mike Armstrong, and we'll go to John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Gary, for the kind of whirlwind tour of the assessment. Appreciate it. So the question I have, I want to hone in on that selectivity block that you noted. I had sort of made a note of that myself, and what I was wondering, because that's an element of the assessment. Everything was pretty stable for a lot of the different sensitivities that you guys tried. The one that has kind of an important impact, depending on the assumption that you make, is the selectivity, that last selectivity block. So you've only got 2 years in there, which you noted. What's your feeling of the ability of the model to kind of estimate parameters for the functional forms there? Did it seem like it could, were they stable? Was it coming up with the same kind of parameter estimates with the various runs, or did there seem like there was kind of a lack of stability there? I was wondering about how much faith we can kind of put in the model's ability to kind of figure out the shape of those selectivities.
Yeah, well, I can tell you offhand that the parameters estimated, the selectivity parameters estimated, have really tight CVs, less than 10%. So there's information there. In terms of the potential shape, that may be an issue. It was my thinking that with the change in size regulations on the coast, going to a 35 minimum size limit, maximum size limit, the selectivity on the ocean, in my mind, should have gone a little dome shaped. And the model still estimated as flat top, but the midpoint, if you will, the LD 50, if you want, whatever you want to call it, actually though slid down, so it's actually encompassing younger fish, which after talking about it for a long time in the group, we kind of considered that kind of could make some sense. It may be different in another model, depending on how you're estimating things. I think I did look at, and I can't remember exactly, I think I did look at leaving out the 2021, just running a 2020, and things came out fairly similar. But I'm more confident that the shape may not change that much as we add data, but it may will once we, at least for the ocean, we might actually start seeing a dome-shaped curve being developed as we add more data. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jay.
Yep, absolutely did. Thanks so much, Gary. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, our next questions is from Mike Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, Gary. I think it's probably in the document. I couldn't find it, but I'm curious, how much did the SSB reference points change with the low productivity?
Well, I have to dig out the old assessment. I think it declined. The SSB in 1995 estimate went down. However, the F estimates associated with that level of SSB that we did through the projection were kind of close to what the benchmark we were using in the benchmark, if I remember correctly. I think it was, the target was like 0.18, and I think the threshold might have been 0.22 or something. Katie, can you remember? Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, we're looking at it. Okay, so yeah, it changed a little bit more than you might think. So the fishing mortality threshold previously was 0.24, and now it's 0.20 with that F, with the low recruitment assumption. So that's the threshold. And similarly, the target, I think, was 0.20 for the sorry, we don't have that. I think it was 0.20 for the old one, and now it's more like 0.17. So I would say it was maybe like a 10 to 20% change on the F side of that. And then there was maybe a 10% change in the SSB threshold and target itself, but that was purely because of changes to what the model was estimating that 1995 SSB to be. And so I would say it was within sort of the confidence intervals of that last reference point.
I must have been thinking of 2017 stock assessment. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, particularly the SSB. So it didn't change radically. It's not like we have a whole new place to go to. It's almost the same. Looking at the retrospective, you decided based on Moan's Row that you didn't adjust it, but just verify this for me. I did a little back of the envelope calculation. Even if you adjusted it, it wouldn't have changed stock status, right? It looks like it might have changed it from 0.14 to 0.15, so we'd still be okay. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
Okay. And this one may be more of a comment. There might be a question coming out of it. The projections seem really sensitive to F, which, no brainer, but we're talking operating in the hundredth place, and a few points change there really changes the course of how we recover. And would you agree with that, Gary?
Yeah, going from 0.13 essentially to 0.2 for the threshold. Yeah, there's considerable increase in catches going from the lower one up to the other, which is why the population levels off at the different Fs. Whether are you asking me whether that's realistic or not? Or?
I conclude with it's just this board should be very cautious because it doesn't take a lot to change the course of the recovery. A very relatively minor change in rise in F, it will put us back in the recovery period. So that was my point. It's just I want to emphasize we have to remain cautious as we move forward.
Yeah, particularly since there's error in the F estimates and stuff like that.
All right. Thanks, Gary. That's all I got.
All right, thanks, Mike. So we'll go to John Clark, Emerson Hasbrook, and Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Gary. I wanted to follow up on SSB. I'm sure it's a simpler question. One thing I found confusing than Mike Armstrong had there, but the benchmark assessment from the 2018 one had the SSB threshold of 202 million pounds, and now with this low recruitment, it's down to 85 million, which is a much bigger. I thought you just said it was a 10% decrease. Am I missing something there?
Yeah, the ones I'm stating are in metric tons. I don't know what it would be in metric tons.
Okay, I was looking at the wrong thing there. But the other thing I just was curious about was that even though they had about the same pattern as the benchmark, that the years of the highest SSB were above the target in this latest assessment, whereas in the benchmark, they never surpassed the target. And is that all just having to do with using the low recruitment assumption, or were there other factors at play there?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I'd have to run the projections again with the old recruitment period. I don't know. You got any idea, Katie?
Yeah, so I don't think the low recruitment assumption doesn't have anything to do with the actual SSB target and threshold. That comes purely out of the model based on the data that we've seen. So the low recruitment assumption then is what level of F do you need to get back to that historical level? So what changed is we've added new years of data. We adjusted sort of the structure of the model a little bit at the end, and that caused a change in some of the historical perception of the stock. And so where that 95 value is now estimated to be lower than it was in the benchmark, and that's then ripples through to the the SSB target. And I would say that now historically it looks like we were above that target. But I would also say that during the benchmark, if you looked at the confidence intervals around the SSB, those confidence intervals did encompass the target. And similarly, they also encompass below the target in this run. So it adjusted the point values that we were really close to the target, but not at it previously. Now we add a little bit more data. The model adjusts itself a little bit, and now we're a little bit above it, but probably within the overall uncertainty of the benchmark and this one.
So the changes you're saying, Katie, that really it's following pretty closely what you saw with the benchmark, even with the changes in the low recruitment, the different selectivity block and all that, everything is following pretty much what we saw with the 2018.
Yes, it's a very small difference. It's just enough to kind of like flip you over that threshold, and as opposed to just being slightly under it now.
Thanks.
So
Just curious about that. Thanks.
All right, thanks, John. Thanks, Katie. We'll go to Emerson Hasbrook and then over to Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Gary, for your presentation. So my question and concern is very similar to what Mike just expressed a couple of minutes ago. So can we put up that slide that had the graphic in the table of rebuilding? It was up there just a couple of minutes ago. Yeah, that one, right. So if the retrospective pattern is showing or is telling us that we tend to overestimate SSB and underestimate F, we're getting close to being on the razor's edge here. As Mike said, you know, a little bit of change in F can have a significant impact on our rebuilding for SSB to target. And if F starts to approach the target or even, you know, the threshold, it's going to have a significant impact here. So are we going to get another update next year, or do we have to wait 2 years?
I believe it's 2 years. But I hear what you're saying. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there any way we could have like an interim update next year to kind of see where we are with F? You know, like I said, we're on the razor's edge here, and if we fall to the unfortunate side, we're going to be in worse shape 2 years from now.
I think that would be up to the board and ASMFC whether they would want us to do another one, because doing an intermediate update it take just as much work to do it. We have to update all the data. Same process we do 2 years from now. So be up to the board.
Emerson, Tony, I think, wants to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That would be the prerogative of the board to make a recommendation to the policy board, and then the policy board would have to take that into consideration. As you all know, we look at the stock assessment schedule every year, and we are almost at, or maybe more than at, capacity for our stock assessment team, as well as the stock assessment members of the states and organizations that partner with us. And so if we add striped bass, we would likely need to take something else off the schedule in order to make time for that. So that would be a consideration that the policy board would need to take into account.
Thanks, Tony. Emerson, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, well, yes, I understand that. I thought there might have been, you know, like a quick and easy way just to update and see where we are with F. But from what Gary said, it doesn't seem like there's a short version here.
I think there is I think what the TC would recommend that we do is, so as part of these projections that you do, what you get out is kind of under this F, what would be your expected level of catch next year and the year after with some confidence intervals. So instead of updating the full model, we could look at the projections and say we would expect, if we are still fishing at our current F or an acceptable level of F, what is the acceptable range of catch to get out of that and still be within your sort of predicted F range. And so then compare that to the removals that we saw in 2022 when we do the FMP review in 2023 and see, you know, are we maintaining current levels of removal that are within our expected rebuilding trajectory? And that would definitely be easier on the technical committee than doing a full assessment update and then do the update again in 2024 and have 2 more years of data to help anchor where we are.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. And if we get to a point, Mr. Chair, where you'd like a motion to that effect, I'd be happy to do that.
Thanks, Emerson. We're going to go to Mike Louisi, and I'd like to go to Justin Davis, and then back to Mike Armstrong.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Gary, thank you for your presentation. So you made a comment during your presentation, which was very well done, by the way, that in speaking about spawning stock biomass, that the regulations that we currently have in place are doing their job. And I'm just interested in understanding maybe a little bit more about what the team that did the assessment discussed regarding maybe some of the social aspects. So are the based on your opinion and the work that you've done over the years with striped bass, is it the regulations that are working, or do we just have less effort and less availability? I'm just asking for your opinion. I think that's important to put on the record based on the comment you made. So thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure about effort. I haven't looked at the effort estimates for MREP to see if they've gone up or down. Potentially we could do that and send out a memo or something. I think actually, in my opinion, up here anyway, Massachusetts, I think that the maximum size limit of 35 is really working. There's a lot of people releasing those big fish now, and I just think it's all part of we're allowing those older, mature fish to survive. So we're getting this uptick in SSB as the 2015 year class is starting to go through. So I think that year class is going to hold us out for a while as the 2018 progresses after that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that helps. It definitely helps. And I think it's a good thing for the public to understand that the actions that we've taken over the years are starting to show signs of progression towards our ultimate goal. And I wanted to get your professional opinion. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Over to Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Gary, for the presentation. I've got a two-parter here, if you'll indulge me, Mr. Chair. The first question has to do with the low recruitment assumption. So based on the presentation we just saw, because we selected the low recruitment assumption in the rebuilding plan in Amendment 7, the projections that were used to develop the reference points, the fishing mortality reference points, and the short-term projections to see where we'd end up by 2029 both use that low recruitment assumption, which is pulling from recruitment from 2008 to 2021. My question is, for the recruitment that we've seen in the last 3 years, which has been below average and kind of concerning, I'm wondering, Gary, can you comment on whether the recruitment we've seen in the last 3 years is within that range that from 2008 to 2021, the sort of low recruitment data set we're using? And, if it's within that range, sort of where does it fall out? Is it 25th percentile, below the median, above the median?
You mean the index, what the index out of Maryland is showing, those last, since 2018, the very low recruitment? How that compares?
Yeah, correct. I'm just trying to get a sense for, with the recruitment we've seen in the last couple of years that's been low, how that compares to that range of years used for the low recruitment assumption.
Yeah, so it includes up to 2021. So I have looked at those the recent values just for edification, using a model to estimate what the age 1 recruitment might be out of the model given the Chesapeake Bay Index, and it's pretty much within the same range that we have in there in terms for the last few years, the 2018 or 19 to 2021 value. So the range is in there. What we don't model in the projections is whether there's, a serial correlation between one year to the next, which in the last values, the last 4 years or so with the Chesapeake Bay seems to be there's a correlation. There's not much happening there. It's all the same level. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks, Gary. The second question I had is probably simpler. If you had made the bias correction to F, based on the slide we're looking at right now, I'm just wondering, if
if F current was bias corrected, where would we kind of fall out relative to the three scenarios here? You know, essentially what would be our probability of being at SSB target by 2029 under that F if it was bias corrected?
It's about, let's see, about 10%. Let me just pull out my calculator here. It would be, the current F would probably go up to 0.1456 around there. So if we look at the values between on the slide here, current F of 0.36 and target of 0.67, you could adjust the SSB projections a little bit downward, and I would think that we would still be reaching the target by 2029 based on what I see on the graph.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Justin. Over to Mike Armstrong.
Thank you for another bite. And this is more of a comment, but I think it's the right time to bring it up. It's following what Emerson said, and I'm extremely sensitive to the workload. But again, this is a multi-billion-dollar fishery, and perhaps, you know, rather than doing a spot assessment, maybe striped bass is the one we should do. Just my opinion. But I looked at the MRIP landings, and they are up considerably this year. There's only one way we can react as a board to low recruitment, and that's maintaining and increasing SSB. And if, in fact, the retrospective is right and we're a little bit higher, and some of the other uncertainty and landings are up, we may, in fact, be at the threshold already after this year. And it would be good to know that. Alternatively, Katie brought up a method. Maybe you can project landings and compare it to what we actually did. And maybe we can say, you know, we're okay. Or conversely say, no, we went up a lot. And that's the problem with, you know, we don't have an output control for the wreck fishery. So this stuff happens again and again. But the main reason we are in this situation is we have never hit our target F, at least for a prolonged period of time. And to prevent that, we need to know what F is. And so I'd advocate for something, even either an update or what Katie was talking about, to kind of give us an idea within 1 year of where we're at. Because and that's because mostly of the recruitment. We need to get SSB up, which may not work, but that's all we can do. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Mike. Emily's going to respond for the staff.
Thanks, Mike. So the method that Katie outlined, where from these projections, we have the projected catch that would keep us at this current F, and we could compare the realized removals next year once we have all the 2022 data to that projected catch. I think that's something we could add to the FMP review process without any sort of motion. We could just do that. If the board did want to see a more full assessment update, that would require a motion for next year. But otherwise, the next update will be in 2024. But we can plan to do that comparison of realized removals versus projected catch next year.
If we did that, would we have time to get the assessment together, or would we wind up in a 2-year period anyway?
Right, so if we did that comparison, that would be in August. We wouldn't have time then to do a 2023 assessment. We'd still be waiting for 2024. So it wouldn't be a sort of wait and see if we want to do a 2023. We'd have to decide pretty soon if we were going to just do the projection comparison or go the full assessment update route next year.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't know quite how to react to that, other than, you know, we're not locked in, and this is kind of crazy speak, but if we find that landings are high and projected to go above F, we could always cut harvest without a quantitative assessment. I could sit here and make a motion and say, let's cut harvest by 10%. I don't know what it'll do. It may cause people to go crazy, but I just think we're in a spot that we need to react. Now that being said, stocks don't collapse overnight. But with 4 years of poor recruitment, we're approaching that point in my mind. So anyway, something to think about for this board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We're still on questions. We have a couple in the queue. We have Steve Train, and then we'll go to Mike Louisi. Is there anybody else who wanted to ask a question who hasn't asked one yet? Around. Okay, that's our queue. And then we're going to pivot to staff. There's some additional information they're going to provide before we open this up to comments and potential reaction to this. So go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I don't want to say confused, but I guess I'm uncertain. One of the people at this table I would ask for advice when trying to decide on a species and what I'm going to vote for or what I think needs to be done is Mike, and I'm not sure I agree with what he's been asking. I mean, for years we've told people when we're managing a fishery to trust the science. We've got some great graphs here of what the science tells us will happen if we maintain the course, and everyone seems worried that it's not enough. Not everyone, but a lot. The stock is overfished, but overfishing is not occurring. Correct me if I say anything wrong, Dr. Nelson. We are now returning trophies, which we didn't for a long time. That's a healthier egg, a better likelihood of survivability, and it seems to me like it's the best thing we've done for the brood stock since I've been on this board. The retrospective analysis appears that this is an adequate, a good model, although it did show us there was a little bit of trouble with the brood stock. But this is the new regime we're in with the management of returning the trophies. The stock will be growing, and if we do nothing, it should recover. If we stay the course, this should recover. That's if we trust the science. The only thing we don't know, I feel like I'm a politician, we don't know the unknowns. We don't know how much effort that we haven't accounted for. So I guess with everything I've heard here, I'm wondering why we're questioning the science so much. And if it's possible that it could be weak, that this isn't accurate because we have an unknown, how much damage can we do if we allow this to go under this for another year or two before we correct it? We're not going to wipe out this fishery. Am I wrong?
I'm just thinking those fronts. So there is error in everything that we're showing here. So things may be a little higher, they may be a little lower. The big issue, I think, in my mind, is we basically have no control on what the recreational fishermen do. You know, it's unlimited access. So if, you know, all of a sudden, like Mike said, there could be a huge increase in landings 1 year. And if that forces the F to go above what we're showing here and the projections at F current, then yes, there can be a definite impact on the rate of recovery of the spawning stock biomass. And yeah, that's just what comes to mind. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if you were talking to me directly or to, it sounded like a lot of people, you've talked to a lot of people on the board too.
So yeah, maybe a little of both, but I guess the question came down to, is it the unknowns that could really mess this up, and could it really cause us a lot of problems in 1 or 2 years? I don't even think that would be big enough to throw us way off course.
Geez, that's hard to say. Depends on what the unknowns are. But yeah, I wouldn't see F, you know, increasing astronomically. It might be within a range that we're showing here. And I don't see any of the selectivity patterns changing majorly with an addition of another year. Yeah, that's a good question, but I really don't have a good feeling about the answer.
All right, thanks, Steve. You're good, Mike?
Yeah, Marty, I'll hold my I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I'll hold my comment and to the point where if somebody does make a motion on action, I'll save it for that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to go ahead and turn to staff now. There's a couple of additional points related to the assessment that they'll provide. So I'll go to Emily.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. We're just taking back the screen here. Real quick, thanks again, Gary, for the presentation. So while we're getting the screen pulled up here, I was just going to quickly go over 2 points related to the stock assessment. The first is the provision in Amendment 7 that specified the possibility of the board taking quick action in response to this assessment, and noting that that does not come into effect, and I will go over that in a minute. And I'm also going to just briefly go over some questions that we've gotten about the juvenile abundance indices related to rebuilding. Again, there's been some questions following the recent release of the JAIs in the Chesapeake Bay. So I'll just briefly go over those 2 topics in just a moment. Perfect. So the first point is the fast track response. You can go to the next slide. So in Amendment 7, we had this provision that if the 2022 assessment indicated that there's less than a 50% chance of rebuilding and at least a 5% reduction is needed, then the board could adjust measures via board action. So by taking action at a board meeting without going through the addendum process. Next slide. As we heard in the presentation, the assessment indicates there's a greater than 50% probability of rebuilding and that no reduction is needed. So neither of these criteria are met. So therefore, this fast track response does not come into effect. So that means that any action the board wanted to take would go through the normal addendum process. Next slide. And then just a couple points on the JAIs. Again, we've gotten some questions with the recent news from the Chesapeake Bay JAIs. Again, as Gary mentioned, there's the 4 JAIs and the 2 age 1 indices that all go into the stock assessment model to estimate age 1 recruitment. And those indices are all weighted by the model. And overall, the Maryland JAI is closely correlated to that model estimate of age 1 recruitment. So that indicates that the Maryland JAI is a good predictor of coastwide age 1 recruits. Next slide. So for this year's stock assessment, the terminal year was 2021. So we have those age 1 estimates of recruitment through 2021. And so that incorporated all those age 0 JAIs through 2020. So those low JAIs from 2019 and 2020 translated into those below average recruits that we saw in the final 2 years of the assessment. And then the most recent JAIs in 2021 and 2022, those will inform age 1 recruitment estimates in the next assessment when we're looking at age 1 recruitment in 2022 and 2023 and so on. So finally, next slide, this assessment used that low recruitment assumption that Gary reviewed. And just to note that these recent below average year classes, these recent JAIs we've seen, those fish aren't going to reach maturity until 2027 and after that. And so these recent low year classes may not impact spawning stock biomass until after that 2029 rebuilding deadline. So future stock assessments are going to be really important to provide those updated projections as we start to see those below average year classes enter the fishery.
Thanks, Emily. Could you remind the board what action is required today as a result of this update?
Sure. So for stock assessment updates, no board motion is required. And as I mentioned, if the board did take any action, that would go through the typical addendum process. If the board didn't take any action, then things would remain as they are, status quo.
Thanks, Emily. So what I'd like to do now before we embark on any additional board discussion is, I know myself and several other board members received a flurry of comments from the public in advance of this meeting. So I would like to carve out 5 minutes and ask if we could put the timer up and initiate it upon the first public comment, but carve out 5 minutes for public comment. And Emily, if you could help me out with that to see if there's anybody that would like to offer comment.
I see one hand on the webinar.
All right, Ross Squire, you'd like to comment?
Okay, great. I actually had 2 questions. Can you explain, when you have the amount of data that's missing in terms of the catch data from a number of rivers and index data that's missing. What accommodation does the technical committee make in terms of estimating the impact of harvest in those areas? And then the second question that I had is, we have a very large year class. The 2015 year class was a 24.2 young of year index versus last year's, the last 4 years coming in at about a 3.2. So you have all of these large numbers of fish now exploitable within the slot. Can you tell me what, if any, impact that has in terms of how F is calculated going forward?
This is Katie. I'll jump in, and then if Gary wants to add anything, he can. And I will say, so number one, I think your first question about missing catch. So catch that we're missing is catch that happens above the tidal limits of MRIP. So, catch in the rivers, essentially the Hudson River, the Delaware River, et cetera. And we've looked at creel surveys that occurred on those rivers in the past and compared them to MRIP estimates for those years. And overall, we found that those estimates of harvest are very tiny, negligible compared to the rest of the coast. So we know it's there. We know we're probably underestimating catch somewhat, but we don't believe it has a significant impact on the stock assessment. In terms of years that we missed sampling because of COVID or because of other issues, basically we just leave those estimates out of the model and the model can smooth over them. And it essentially just increases some of the uncertainty in the final results that are carried through into the projections to try to figure out how much uncertainty there is around those percentages. So we know that it does increase the uncertainty, and that's sort of feeding into the projections. It's basically we can't correct for it or accommodate those missing surveys because we don't know what happened. But we do have data from, it's not a complete lack of data. We do have data from other surveys that happened. It's just less information for the model to use. And again, that uncertainty gets propagated through the projection. So when we're talking about that probability of rebuilding, some of that uncertainty about what happened in 2020 is included in those projections. And then the second question about, those fish entering the new slot, and that is taken into account when we do these projections, so that we start with that population. You can see the 2015 and the 2018 year classes where they are now just starting to enter those fisheries. And as we project them forward, we move them, and so the model will see, how vulnerable they are to the fishery as it stands now. And they will also see, the amount of removals that we're expecting. So as these strong year classes enter the fisheries, it is expected that catch will go up somewhat because there are just more fish out there, and that won't necessarily make F go up. However, there is a limit to where, as catch increases, it will start to drive fishing mortality up, even as strong year classes come in to help support that catch. So the model is aware of those year classes and how the fishery is impacting them, and it moves them forward to try to figure out how all of those things interact when we are finishing or finalizing our probabilities of rebuilding after that timeline.
Entering the slot will adjust F, or will it not? Is it just a data point that you're aware of, or is there some accommodation made for a significantly large year class entering the slot?
So the model knows that they're entering, and then it will take out it will expect that your catch will go up if you keep effort constant. So I think what the model will not know is whether those increasingly available fish will cause effort to increase, which will drive your fishing mortality up more than we would expect. So that I think is harder to keep an eye on. But that's again why we would want to go back and check kind of how does the catch that we're seeing in 2022 compare to how much catch we would expect, given that these strong year classes are now more available to the fishery, and whether or not that catch indicates that effort is going up as well as the catch.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ross. Good questions. We're going to take one more comment, and that's from Tony Frieder.
There we go. Essentially, we're recording. Thank you so much for the time. Sincerely appreciate this. So I'm looking at the conclusion slide, and it says there's sources of uncertainty that the 2020 and 2021 data are uncertain because of COVID-19. Underestimates F, and we only have 2 years of data with the new selectivity blocks. We're betting the house because we have 3 good year classes left, and that's the 15s, 17s, and 18s. And there's no regulation changes. We know that Maryland and New Jersey can keep their CE plans, and that is not what the public wanted through the Amendment 7 process. You had over 6,000 comments with 98% saying to put guardrails on CE. You know, I don't know how long people can remember back, but we bet the house on the 2011 year class, and that did not work out very well. We should have taken more reductions. We took less reductions than we should have. The 2011 year class never came through. And are we betting the house that this selectivity block is going to work out as we think it's going to, with squishy data on 2020 and 2021 and a retrospective pattern that underestimates F, with the 2015s have just entered the slots, the slot. The 2017s are coming up. 2018s will be right behind them. And we know, based on history, that if there's more fish out there, it will increase exponentially. And it's so fractional that we have to maintain this F in order to meet our conservation goals for 2029. I feel like this is a little loosey-goosey, and there's one other thing that I just kind of like to point out. You know, not only is this not in the spirit of Amendment 7, but I'm not trying to be too abrasive when I say this, but effort is down because the fishing hasn't been as good. And you can't say these regulations are the thing that's making the difference, because there's other forces at work. You have 2021 and 2020 data that's uncertain at best because of COVID. And we know that some areas are doing really well, and some areas it's like the Dead Sea. So I wouldn't hang your hat necessarily on these regulations, because you're going to have all 3 of those year classes in the slot, and F is going to go up. And then when we come back to the table in a couple of years, we're not going to have anything to work with, because there are no year classes really between 2019 and 2022. And you know, again, I'll just put an exclamation point on it. The public is pretty loud and clear, and they certainly do not want to see CE without guardrails. And thank you so much for the time, Marty. I appreciate it, and you know, thank everyone else as well.
All right, thank you, Tony. I appreciate that. All right, we're going to return the discussion to the board for any potential action. I'll open it up to discussion. Tom Fody.
I've been sitting around this table for a long time, and we try to do what is right. We trust the science, we work on the science, whether it's social crafts or whatever. The science isn't perfect. We all know that. And also, every time we tweak one thing, we wind up doing something else. I remember back when I changed size limits on striped bass 3 years in a row because it showed different things, so somebody tweaked it this way or that way. Then we took this, we basically counted these surf fishermen in a bigger range than they've ever been. And that's why we were overfishing when we put this amendment through. Now, we're saying it'll help the sporting stock biomass because we'll have larger sporting stock and make heavier recruitment. Well, we did that. We said the same thing on weakfish, some winter flounder, and bluefish. I mean, bluefish were doing great. We put a 10-fish bag limit and then went down the tank. It had nothing to do with the bag limit or the commercial fishery. It had to do with the environmental conditions. And we can all control the environment. We put a lot of restrictions in place. Some of us didn't agree with the size limit slot that you picked, because it basically targeted what we thought would be the year classes
coming along. But no, everybody didn't want to go to a bigger fish or a smaller fish. They just wanted to move along. I'm satisfied. And you forget, I got involved in this whole process in '86 because of striped bass. And I wouldn't do anything that would imperil the stocks. And yes, science is going to say we can do it. It might work out. And if we make a mistake, we'll basically correct it. But we don't, if we start jerking around every year saying, well, and also I didn't hear one of those persons say, suppose we got a big young of the year next year and we showed that the numbers were up. Do we want to increase the stock? Do we want to increase the catch? So I'm satisfied where we are. And we don't have to make a motion to approve the stock assessment rule we told. So I agree with the stock assessment.
Any other comment from the board? Lauren?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Emily, and thank you for the excellent report to us. Early on in your slide presentation, I was very impressed by the phrase, I think, that was used either by you vocally or on the slide itself, that there was a greater than 50% probability of recovery. Can you be more definitive in that? You know, if for example, if it's 51% probability of recovery, that means there's a 49% probability of failure. So it would be helpful to me to know what that number might be in your estimation. Thank you.
Thanks. So in Amendment 7, that provision specified that 50% cutoff as the metric for sort of success of whether the measures have a certain probability of rebuilding. So the board agreed that with if there was a greater than 50% chance, then the board, you know, potentially wouldn't have to take action. If there was a less than 50% chance, the board could act quickly to take action. And from the assessment, there's under the current fishing mortality rate, there's a 78% chance that the stock will rebuild by 2029. So that's where we're at. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question.
Thanks, Lauren. Any other comments? I'll ask the question of the board. We can accept this as is unless somebody has a motion that would like to advance forward. It's alternative to accepting this. Are there any such motions? Mike?
It's a comment, maybe leading to a motion. I've heard a few comments, and I just want to talk to them. To Steve Train, I don't criticize science, but we have empirical data. I'm looking at the MRIP estimates for this year. Through the first 4 waves, we're up between 17% or 1,000%. Pick your state. We're up. F is up. It has to be up. And to Tom Foty's point, we've failed time and time again because we did not hit the target F. And that's my concern and why I think we need to track it better at this point in time. And the only way we can do that is with an assessment or a projection. Anything would be helpful. So that being said, I will make a motion to accept the stock assessment as presented today.
Thanks, Mike. We don't actually need a motion to accept the assessment. So thank you.
Yeah, but I wanted to do that.
All right, before we move on, Emerson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, I believe Emily said that we do not need a motion to take a look at that projected catch and actual catch. So are we to assume then that the TC will be able to do that for us next year?
Yes, as part of the FMP review process, which is typically in August of next year, once we have all the 2022 landings, we can include that in the FMP review, that comparison of what the catch was in 2022 versus what the assessment projected catch would be to maintain that F. So yes, we will include that next year.
Great, thank you.
Got a couple of hands that popped up. I'm going to go to Chris Bat-Savage and then Mike, and we're going to finish there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, sorry for the last minute question. Emily, just to understand, when we look at catch from the FMP review next year, and we see that it's quite a bit higher than what we projected, would that be an opportunity for the board to initiate an action to reduce catch? And if so, would that possibly be in place by the 2024 fishing year if the board decided to go that route?
I'll go to Tony first.
Chris, you could initiate an action through an addendum or an amendment at any time the board desires. If we initiated action in August, I think it would be pretty difficult to get it in time for the 2024 fishery.
Yeah, so I think it would be difficult to get anything in place by 2024. One other potential direction is maybe we could have an earlier meeting with the TC earlier in the spring once MRIP estimates are finalized, and maybe bring it to the May meeting. We won't probably have final commercial landings by that point. And I'm not promising that's going to happen by May, but we could maybe talk to the TC and the plan review team about taking an earlier look at the MRIP estimates and just having a discussion of where we are at that point.
Does that answer your inquiry, Chris? Okay. Mike, you have the last word.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris asked my first question, and then, so I did have a question, if I could ask it through you to staff. What's being planned as far as the comments that were made about a follow-up? Is that going to be an ASMFC only? Is that going to be ASMFC only work, or is it going to require the Science Center as part of that as well? Because the interaction that I have as the chairman of the Mid-Atlantic Council with our Northeast Regional Coordinating Committee, which includes Bob and Tony and Chairman Reed and others, I just wonder how that would all fit in. But if it's an ASMFC only thing, then I can fully support that.
Yeah, it would be an ASMFC only thing with the in-house plan review team and technical committee, and maybe the stock assessment committee if needed.
You good, Mike?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thanks, Marty.
All right, thanks everybody for that discussion. And Gary, before we move on, I want to just thank you on behalf of the board for all of your hard work, the hard work of the technical committee and the stock assessment subcommittee. So, Dr. Nelson, thank you so much for all that good work. We're going to move on to item number 5, consider draft addendum 1 on quota transfers for public comment. I'll turn to Emily.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to echo those thanks to Gary as well. So today I'll provide an overview of draft addendum 1 to amendment 7 for board review today. Next slide. So I'll start with the statement of the problem here for this draft addendum. So there were questions and concerns that have been raised about the striped bass commercial quota system, with some particular concern about the current use of the 1970s reference period as the basis for state commercial quotas, and also other issues and questions about how the quota system could be set up. And so all of these concerns were included in the scoping document for draft amendment 7 last year in 2021. But ultimately, this issue of addressing commercial quotas was not selected for further development in draft amendment 7. And some board members expressed support for addressing the commercial quota issue separately from amendment 7 with the intent of not slowing down the progress on amendment 7. So in August 2021, next slide, the board did initiate this draft addendum to consider allowing for the voluntary transfer of striped bass commercial quota in the ocean region. And that was in order to consider a management option that could provide some more immediate relief to states that were seeking a change to their commercial quota. So again, this would be separate from addressing those other concerns raised about the quota system. And as we all know, other commission managed species do allow for the voluntary transfer of commercial quota, and quota transfers can address issues like shifting stocks and quota overages, et cetera. So here is the current timeline on the next slide for the draft addendum. After the board initiated the addendum in August of last year, the PDT developed the first draft of that draft addendum. In October of last year, the board deferred consideration and later postponed until August of this year. So just a couple months ago in August, the board provided additional guidance to the PDT for further development. So the PDT revised the draft addendum for the board's review today, and the board is considering approving the draft addendum for public comment. If approved, public comment could potentially occur from November through January, although I will note it might be a little bit tough to schedule hearings depending on how many there are with the holidays, but we could probably make it work. And then if that happened, the board could consider final action in February 2023. Next slide. So the initial development of the draft addendum last year was constrained due to the focus of the board and the PDT on Amendment 7. So the board provided additional guidance a couple months ago, and the PDT met a couple times over the past few months to revise the draft addendum for board review. So today I'll review the PDT revisions. Next slide. I'll outline a question the PDT has to the board and go over the range of options that are in the draft addendum. And this was all in a PDT memo that was in supplemental materials. Next slide. So for the introductory portion of the draft addendum, the PDT did some significant revisions to the background section to focus more narrowly on the commercial quota system itself and the ocean fishery, since that is the focus of this addendum. It includes a more detailed history of quota changes in the FMP, both pre and post Amendment 6, and also includes some pertinent information on ocean quota utilization. So here's an example of one of the new figures showing the ocean commercial landings in the blue bars underneath the total ocean quota, that red line, and it lists the percent quota utilization each year. Again, this was information that PDT thought was relevant to the discussion. So the quota utilization section in the draft addendum, next slide, also includes the PDT's concern that we had originally discussed last year, which is that quota transfers could potentially increase the utilization of the total ocean quota, and this could potentially undermine the goals of the reductions taken under Addendum 6. So the commercial fishery has consistently underutilized its quota due to fish availability and also some states prohibiting commercial fishing. In the Addendum 6 calculations assumed that the commercial fishery would continue to underutilize its quota as it has in the past. So this assumption might be violated if quota transfers do occur. So moving into the proposed options, the options consider allowing for the voluntary transfer of commercial quota in the ocean region between states that have ocean quota. And if transfers are permitted, the draft addendum states that quota would be transferred pound for pound. And I'll come back to that at the end to go over the PDT's discussion on that point. The draft addendum options do not address Chesapeake Bay quota, just the ocean quota. And the options also do not consider transfers between the ocean and the Chesapeake Bay. And then the PDT had a discussion about commercial quota that through CE is reallocated to the recreational sector. And the PDT determined that commercial quota that has been reallocated to a state's recreational fishery, so to a bonus program, is not eligible to be used for quota transfers. This is due to the complexity of accounting for, moving quota back and forth between the sectors during the year. So, when states are developing their CE proposals in the first place, they could specify that they want to reallocate part or all of their quota to the recreational sector. And if they choose to leave some of that quota in its original commercial quota form, that would be eligible for transfer. But anything that's reallocated to the recreational fishery would not be eligible to be transferred. So getting into the options themselves, the revised draft for review today now includes some additional options. So there's sort of a range of options considering allowing voluntary transfers of ocean quota. So status quo is option A, in which transfers are not permitted. That's the current status quo. And then the alternatives range from option B, which would be a general transfer provision similar to other ASMFC species. Option C would limit transfers based on stock status. Option D would give the board discretion to decide on whether to permit transfers each year and potentially establish some criteria around that. And then option E combines the stock status limitations and the board discretion into one option. So For the alternatives, you're sort of starting with option B, which is sort of the least restrictive if you're going to allow transfers. You kind of move down to option E, which would be the most restrictive for allowing transfers. So getting into the details, option B would be that general transfer provision for voluntary transfers of ocean quota. Again, similar to the transfer process in place for several other ASMFC species. The transfers may occur at any time during the year and up to 45 days after the last day of the calendar year. All transfers require a donor and receiving state, and the administrative commissioners must submit a signed letter, and there's no limit on the amount of quota that can be transferred, and transfers do not require approval by the board. And these transfers don't permanently affect the state-specific quota shares, and the state receiving the quota is responsible for any overages. So next slide, the PDT did have a question for the board regarding the 45-day window provision. So in addition to voluntary quota transfers providing, in-season relief for states, is it also the board's intent for quota transfers to address overages after the season ends? If not, the board could remove this 45-day provision from the draft addendum. So that's a question for discussion at the end of the presentation. So moving on to option C would limit transfers based on stock status. So voluntary transfers would not be permitted if the stock is overfished. Again, it would be the same general transfer process, but with that built-in stock status limitation. This type of option has been raised during board and PDT discussions and also in public comments. So this type of option would address concerns about allowing quota transfers during stock rebuilding. However, the PDT noted that given the current overfish status of the stock, this option would not provide that near-term relief to states that were seeking additional quota, which was part of the basis for this addendum. So moving into option D, this is the board discretion option. So the board would decide whether voluntary transfers are permitted in the next 1 or 2 years. So this option was added at the last board meeting in August. So the process would be that the board would decide by their final meeting of the year whether to allow transfers in the next 1 or 2 years, based on information on the status of the stock and also performance of the fisheries. The PDT did add here some flexibility for the board to decide every 1 or 2 years. 2 years is on track with when stock assessments would occur, so that might be some good flexibility. And then the PDT also added a note that transfers are not permitted unless the board decides to allow them. So if the board for some reason doesn't make a decision for a particular year, then transfers would not be permitted until the board decides to allow them. So next slide, if the board did with this board discretion decide to allow transfers, next slide, the board could specify some criteria. So the board could set a limit on how much quota could be transferred in a year. So for example, only X number of pounds could be transferred in year 2024. And further, the board could set a seasonal limitation on when quota could be transferred. So for example, the board could say, no more than 50% of that quota amount could be transferred before July, with the intent there of, saving quota throughout the year if states with different seasons, might decide they want a quota transfer at different times. The board could also determine the eligibility of a state to receive a transfer based on the percentage of that state's quota landed. So for example, states may not request a quota transfer until it has landed X% of their quota. The PDT noted that if any of these criteria are implemented, the board should be as specific as possible with these criteria. And then finally, for this option on board discretion on the timeline, if the board selects this option and the addendum is approved in the middle of next year, 2023, the board could decide at the time the addendum is approved whether or not to allow transfers for the rest of that year. And then the board would start the regular process of deciding on transfers, at the end of the year before the next. So finally, our last option here is option E. And that's combines both that stock status option and the board discretion into one option. So the board would still decide whether voluntary transfers are permitted, except you have this built-in provision that transfers are not permitted when the stock is overfished. Again, the PDT notes here that this, given the current overfish status of the stock, this type of option would not provide near-term relief to states seeking quota at this time. So the final section of the document is the compliance section on the next slide. And basically any measures approved by the board would be effective immediately. And just a note here that if quota transfers are permitted, states would need to account for any transfers and potentially order some extra commercial tags to account for additional quota that they might receive. And then I'll just wrap up with a couple slides on the PDT's discussion about transfers between states with different size limits. So one of the PDT's concerns about quota transfers is that a pound of striped bass quota is not equal across states. So this concern was also previously noted by the technical committee during discussion of Addendum 4 in 2014. We know that state commercial fisheries catch different sized striped bass due to multiple factors, the variability of striped bass size distribution along the coast, and also different state management programs, different gear, size limits, etc. And then further, through CE, states have made adjustments to their commercial size limits over time, deviating from the historical standard size limit. So this has resulted in changes to some commercial quotas over time. So standard pound for pound transfers would be most efficient, but they wouldn't address this uncertainty of moving quota between states that catch different size fish. So per the board's request, the PDT did discuss this. So the PDT first considered a same number of fish approach. So the intent here would be to transfer the same number of fish to the receiving state as would have been caught by the donor state under the transfer quota amount. So this analysis would require an average weight of commercially harvested fish for both states to convert from pounds to number of fish. After you have the average weight for both states, it's a pretty straightforward calculation. However, the PDT discussed that determining what average weight to use could be difficult because, one, not all states have recent commercial harvest, and then two, for those that do, commercial catch and the size of the fish caught can vary within the season, depending on gear type, time of year, or the area within the state. So the technical committee could provide some criteria to determine the average weight for each state, but there would still be some assumptions associated with those calculations. And then second, the PDT considered a maintain spawning potential approach. So the intent here would be maintaining at least equivalent spawning potential as the quota moves from the donor state size limits to the receiving state size limits. This would require yield per recruit and spawning stock biomass per recruit, YPR and SPR analysis, and this is the same methodology that's been used in commercial CE programs. And this type of analysis requires several inputs, including natural mortality, weights at age, maturity, selectivity curves, etc. So this approach could more thoroughly address concerns about different size limits, but it would be a complex and time-consuming approach and would require likely a TC review. So ultimately, the PDT supports moving forward with the standard pound-for-pound transfer approach. Considering the complexity of the alternative approaches, particularly considering that it potentially could be a small amount of quota that could be transferred, and those transfers again are voluntary. The revised draft addendum is currently written with the standard pound-for-pound transfers, and there's a note about the inherent uncertainty of transferring a quota between states that catch different size striped bass. And the PDT noted that this uncertainty could potentially be limited if there's criteria set to limit how much quota is transferred. So that wraps up my presentation of the draft addendum, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Emily. For efficiency sake, I'd like to go ahead and get board feedback for Emily, and you can either ask questions or comments. Before we do that, Emily, it's just, you may have mentioned this, but can you characterize the current prohibition on the state transfers related to how the PDT recommendation compares for other species that have state quotas, if that makes sense?
Sure. So as far as the range of options, you can actually go to the next slide, or 2 slides in maybe. Yeah, this is perfect. So I think all other ASMFC species that allow commercial quota transfers have something like option B, sort of a general transfer provision with no specific restrictions. So the option C through E would be generally more restrictive compared to other species that allow transfers.
All right, thank you. So we'll open it up for questions and or comments for Emily. I'll look to the board. All right, we'll start with Megan Ware and then Doug Grout.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a question for Emily. So something I think I've been focused on is the kind of what the PET put forward, that a pound of quota in one state is not equal in another state. And I appreciate their discussion on trying to figure out the best way to handle that. And I think the fact that the quota is tied to a limit makes it different from other species that allow quota transfers, at least for what I can think of in terms of fishery management plans at the commission. So in the spirit of trying to come up with a simpler approach to handle that, I'm wondering if the PET discussed some sort of conservation tax. And I'm getting this from the lobster fishery management plan, where we have a conservation tax on traps. So if someone had a 10,000 pound transfer and you had a 5% conservation tax, the transfer would be 9,500 pounds. So it's not, or it's a way to kind of address some of that uncertainty simply, but still allow transfers.
The PDT did not discuss that concept. It did not come up at the PDT level.
Okay, well, I'll throw that out there for board consideration. I don't know if anyone likes that idea or people don't like that idea, but it may be a way to address that discrepancy between the quotas.
Thank you, Megan. We'll go to Doug Grout and then Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had similar thoughts and concerns as Megan, when it came down to seeing this before I got the supplemental materials and this potential addendum. And I was thinking about all the different size limits and going, whoa, this is more difficult than other species that we do allow the quota transfers. And when you came up with the options that you suggested here, one of the things that struck me was that in option E, where the board would set things up, you had some suggestions about potentially limiting the transferability or the eligibility of a state to receive a transfer based on the percentage of the quotas landed. And I thought that was a good way of dealing with. But I started to think that maybe we should have something like that as a concept under B, which gets back to your conservation tax, something where the entire, because we're in a overfish status, maybe you could allow some limited amount of transferability that we would set ahead of time if we approved option B, but we would need to have something where the board, when they make the final decision, could say, okay, only 90% of the quotas can, or 80% or something like that, which would get down to a transfer tax.
I think I see what you're saying. I think that most would be incorporated under the current option D, where the board has flexibility to set those types of criteria, but there is no criteria in there about this sort of conservation tax, this extra sort of, I guess, penalty. I don't know if that's the right word for it, that a state would have to take by accepting a transfer. So I think maybe if that's something the board wanted to add, that could potentially be added as a criteria, maybe under option D.
Not under option D, I was looking under option B, because I'm looking for something where the, D and E are where the board has the discretion to do it for a 2-year period. I was trying to think of if there's a way where we could just put this into an option that we accept, that we could potentially accept when approving this addendum, and it would just keep going forward as opposed to every 2 years the board making a decision on this.
Got it. I see what you're saying. So it would be sort of a sub option of option B, where it would be transfers are permitted except there's this conservation tax associated with it.
Final question, if we were to do that, if we were going to make a motion to do that, would that delay us approving this for going out to public hearing, or could we just add that in with a motion here and then sending this out to public hearing at this meeting?
I think it might kind of be right on the line. You know, it could be a general enough criteria that if the board was comfortable, staff could add that in. But if you wanted to see it more fleshed out, then the PDT could meet and the process could be delayed until the next cycle. I'll turn to Tony.
The one other option that the board has, which we've done rarely but have done before, is send the text out to the board to approve in an email vote, just on that one part.
Doug, would that work for you? It would. I was just having a sidebar with Megan if she'd given any thought to what the conservation tax amount would be, because then we had something in mind, we could just give you some guidance on that.
We can come back, but I will say we would need a motion if this is going to advance. Dennis, we have you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know how big of a can of worms we're opening here. And I do thank Emily for putting all of this together. As we started this, it might have seemed like a simple task to enact some sort of a transfer system. But as we peel the onion back, there's so many factors involved. And one of the things that I would like clarity on, or might be helpful in my decision making, would be to know, I think you said in your presentation that something like 76% of the commercial quotas utilized most recently. And I would be interested in knowing which states are using their commercial quota entirely, which states would become interested borrowing states that are using 100% of their quota, which aren't, and what is the total of that, say, 24% unused quota? What does that represent in poundage? You know, how much striped bass would we be looking for to transfer? So, not opposed to this entirely, but I think there's still, to me, a lot of unanswered questions that we should know. And I'm not sure, you know, what the acceptance rate would be when undoubtedly by transferring quota, we would be in some sense increasing mortality. And that goes along with our previous discussion also of where we're going with striped bass recovery. Those are just thoughts that I had.
So I can respond to your question about quota utilization. We did include a table with state-by-state quota utilization, and in 2021, all states that have a commercial fishery used almost 100% of their quota. About 13% of the ocean quota is held by North Carolina, and they've had zero harvests for the past decade or so. And then about 10% of the ocean quota is held by states that prohibit commercial fishing.
So that's a good answer. So are we really curing a problem by going in this direction is my question.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In answer to Dennis, the reason we brought this up is because, yes, it does. It is an approach to a problem that I think we've been bringing up here for, I don't even remember when we started on this process, but it was probably back when the halcyon days when striped bass were not overfished. But here we are. Anyhow, my question was, Emily, you had one slide where it had something that the board had to decide on. does that need to be done before we can approve this for public comment, or is that something that can be done after the fact?
I think it would be best to address that question. This is the question about the 45-day provision. I think if we left it in, could the board take it out upon final approval? Yeah, okay, so just
So
saying.
that's okay.
It's okay to leave it in now. The board could take out that 45 provision later if they
And
wanted.
then to the point that Megan and Doug made, if the board wanted something like that done, could we approve the addendum for public comment and add that provision in before it actually goes to any hearings?
Yes, so yeah, to your question about the 45-day period, that could be decided later at the time of addendum approval. To the options that Doug and Megan were potentially talking about, which is that conservation tax criteria. Yes, I think as Tony mentioned, we could sort of in the next week or so, if there was some text staff could put together to come up with a sub option that could be approved by the board via email. It could be put into the draft addendum, approved for public comment. I think we would still need a motion to add such a sub option with the text finalized in the next week.
In that case, Mr. Chair, would it help to have a motion on the table to further this discussion, or would you rather wait on that?
It would.
Okay, well, in that case, I would like to move for the board to approve draft addendum 1 to amendment 7 to the Atlantic Striped Bass Interstate Fishery Management Plan for public comment.
Do we have a second to Mr. Clark's motion? Pat Gear. All right, I'll open it up for discussion on the motion. Go ahead, Pat. Go ahead, John.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. As I think everybody's aware, Delaware has been bringing this up. I think everybody knows our Commissioner Craig Pugh, who is a commercial fisherman, that this is a valuable small-scale fishery. Once again, we are not talking about a lot of striped bass in the grand scheme of things here. I also want to point out, of course, that commercial fishermen target striped bass in our area because there's a market for this, and it's everybody in the Mid-Atlantic enjoys having striped bass in the springtime. It's a very big item in restaurants and for the public. So, once again, this is something that would just be very helpful in states like Delaware. As we know, we've got this sclerotic allocation system based on the 1970s landings, and this gives us a way, without going through the full reallocation process, which we know will be difficult, to allow a state that, as anybody who looks at Table 2 can see, Delaware does utilize its quota. We have a very good accounting system. We have double tagging where the netters have to tag every striped bass they catch. They then have to take to a weigh station where it gets another tag. Both report daily. So this is not a situation where we're just looking for more and there's a lot of problems with our system. I think we have a very good system, and we certainly understand the striped bass is currently in an overfished status, but at the same time, we think hopefully as things improve that the board could see fit to allow a state like Delaware under these very controlled conditions to get a little bit more quota. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Pat, as a seconder, do you have any comments?
No, I'd just like to add, I don't think John is looking for a whole lot of quota. John, I think it wasn't a whole lot you were looking for.
No, we would not be asking for all of North Carolina's unused quota, obviously, just starting off small and,
Yeah, I think this addendum also, it has enough flexibility in there. If the board decides they don't want to do this, some of those options allow the board to make that decision. So I think it's, in that regard, I'd like to see it move forward with the options that are in here.
Any other comments on the motion? Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually, when Mr. Pugh made the original motion to go down this road. I actually seconded that motion because I was interested in it. And I have no problem going out to the public. But to Mr. Abbott's point, right, other than Chris Bat Savage is going to be the most popular man in the entire world, I'm not really sure where quota will come from. You got Maine and New Hampshire have no commercial fishery, and their total quota is about 6,000 pounds, maybe something like that. Connecticut and New Jersey give their quota to their recreational sector, so there's probably zero available there, which leaves North Carolina as, like I said. But it's just a comment more than anything. I mean, this is not an easy lift. There's going to be a lot of discussion about it, but thank God Delaware only wants a handful of fish because that's all that's going to really be available. I guess that's my point. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And Megan, did you have a comment or?
Yeah, I'm gonna make, I would like to make a motion to amend. And I'll read it and then I have it on a piece of paper, so I'll pass it to staff. But it would be keeping the first part of the original motion. So move to approve draft addendum 1 to amendment 7 to the interstate fishery management plan for public comment, and add move to amend to add. Thank you, Katie. Yes, move to amend to add that if a stock is overfished, apply a 5% conservation tax to address the discrepancy that a pound of striped bass quota is not equal across all states. And it will apply to options B and D. And if I get a second, I'll just provide one more piece of rationale.
Doug Grout seconds that motion to amend. Great. Megan, back to you. You want to go ahead and describe your rationale?
Yeah, I mean, I think people understand the idea. I think this is going to be a criticism that we hear in the hearings that that the quota is tied to the size limits that states have. So this is trying to preemptively address a comment that I think we're going to hear pretty strongly at public hearings.
Thank you, Megan. Doug, as a seconder.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and what this gets from my point of view is an option where we don't have to go to the board every 2 years to put these things in place. It just gets put in place and is done with sufficiency.
Thank you. Sheree Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm definitely for this motion to amend. My question is to Megan. 5% is arbitrary. So are we still going to have the TC or PDT take a look at this to see if maybe they can come up with something less arbitrary? Because I know I'm going to get, how do we get that 5% conservation tax number when we get into the public meetings?
So to get PDT or TC feedback, we wouldn't be able to approve it for public comment today. We'd have to have a PDT or TC meeting. So that would be the choice of the board if you wanted to go forward with approving it for public comment today with a number or getting some PDT feedback. And Tony has a comment.
And Emily, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but the PDT did talk about, and you presented on the issue of the pounds not being equal across the board, and they did not provide an option for the document. So I'm not sure the PDT is going to be able to provide you a ton of feedback based on that response from the PDT. I'm not going to speak for all the members, but that would be a sense that I might have. And I don't know what the TC will provide back as well, unless you have a more specific question that you want them to get at. I mean, I guess you could just, it's the appropriate amount, but you could have a range and then the TC could look at it while the comment is going out. If you want to expedite this, if you I'm just trying to help the board have a path to approve this today because it seems like that's what people are looking to do. So if that's what you wanted to do, if you gave a range, then the TC could comment on that range.
Sherry, do you have any additional thoughts? I think Megan also wants to make a comment.
Yeah, I think we're doing a little sidebar here between me and Megan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair criticism that the 5% is ad hoc. This is just trying to minimize some discrepancy that we see between the different states' quotas. I'm not trying to make this more complicated than it already is turning out to be. So I think a priority is approving this for draft addendum today. So I'm fine with the 5%.
All right. Any other comments from board members? Tom Foti.
It's interesting sitting in this room because the last time I sat in this room was a striped bass hearing that Noah was putting on, and Bill Hogarth was the hearing officer. And this was when they opened the EZ, and that was 1995. And it wound up, Bill says, you maybe rent this room to sit all those people. And he says, you're going to have empty seats. He said, I'll pay you dinner. So at the end of the night, there was over 950 people in this room. So Bill bought me dinner and had to do with striped bass. So it seems like it's a perfect issue. And it was keeping the EZ closed. But I think I just throw that in because that was the last time I was in this room.
Thank you, Tom. Katie, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, so I think to Cherie's question about like, is there a hard and fast number that we could come up with? And I would say from a technical standpoint, the TC hasn't discussed this, but the PDT has, and I was part of those discussions. And I think the PDT came to the conclusion that if there was a way to do this quantitatively, they would have done it and provided you with that as a way to correct for that. And so I think it comes back then to the board's sort of a risk tolerance of how risky or how conservative do you want to be, recognizing this as a source of uncertainty that we can't really quantify.
And I guess I would add to that I think the PDT noted that it could be maybe quantified, but it would be like every transfer would be unique. It wouldn't be a simple calculation in any way.
Sure, go. Do you want to reply to that? And I'll go to Joan.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm fine with the 5%, but I think we just have to make sure that we understand at the public hearing that we need to just indicate this is arbitrary numbers. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheree. John?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just want to be clear. So in other words, if a state asks for 100 pounds, they get 95. Is that okay? So they better not ask for 110 then, right? And
thanks, John. Back here.
And just to be clear, under option D, the board has the discretion to do what they want if that option is selected in the final addendum. So in that regard, it's not needed. This motion is not needed if option D is selected, because we can put, we've already talked about you already have to have 90% of your quota landed for the year. We talked about having a maximum amount of transferability. So I don't think it's needed for option D.
So just to respond to that, so the option D provides two types of criteria. The board can specify the state eligibility and then also how much can be transferred. So by adding this provision to option D, this would be in a situation where the board decides to allow transfers when the stock is overfished, then this would come into play. The board could still decide whether or not to allow transfers when the stock is overfished, and if they do, then we would just have this 5% conservation tax built in.
All right. So any other discussion, or are we ready to call the question on the motion to amend? Oh, I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I might be missing something, but John was being facetious, but it's absolutely true. If I was coming for 100,000 pounds of quota, I'd ask for 110. And I did exactly what I wanted. And it has zero conservation value. Isn't that correct? Because we can ask for whatever we want. And I'll leave it at that for this. I have lots to say about whatever becomes the main motion, but I won't start with that yet.
Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, the way I see this is that there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences. I just said to John, we get this through for Delaware, but he's going to be fighting 3 other states for the fish out of the Carolinas. He might not even get it. But if you've got a 5% transfer tax, before all that fish is gone, 5% of that quota that's being transferred is going to disappear to protect other fish. even if it doesn't meet what you just said, because he's going to get his full 100 pounds. There will be fish saved.
If I could just respond, under the condition that we use all the latent latent quota, which we can get into that in a second.
All right, thank you. So if there's any other discussion, we'll go ahead and call the question on the motion to amend. Let's try this. Is there any opposition to the amended motion? The motion to amend. Seeing none, the motion to amend passes. And now that's the original motion. And for the record, I'll ask again. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read the main motion into the record, and then we'll have a discussion. Motion to, is it the top one? It's the bottom one. Okay, sorry. All right, we'll go ahead and read this into the motion, into the record. Move to approve draft addendum 1 to amendment 7 to the Interstate Fisheries Management Plan for public comment. If the stock is overfished, apply a 5% conservation tax to address discrepancy that a pound of striped bass quota is not equal across all states. This would apply to options B and D. Any additional discussion before we take a vote? Tom Foti.
I have a minute to caucus.
1 minute for a caucus, then we'll vote. All right, let's go ahead and try to see if we can achieve consent. Is there any objection to the main motion that's up on the board? Seeing no objection, the motion passes. Are we ready to move on, Emily, for our next item on the agenda? Is number 6, review and populate advisory panel membership. Tina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I offer for the board's consideration and approval the nomination of Craig Proceedings. I'm sorry if I said it wrong. Poosikian, commercial rod and reel fisherman from Massachusetts.
So we have a nomination. Ray?
Yes, that's Craig Proceedings. He's been a lifelong commercial, recreational shell fisherman, hook and line, striper fisherman. I've known him for years. He was born and raised in Tom Foti's fine state of Jersey, and then he moved to Massachusetts. And I'm recommending him for the AP. I think he'll be an addition to the AP. Yeah, by all means. Move to approve Craig Proceedings, representing Massachusetts, to the Striped Bass Advisory Panel.
A second. Justin Davis. Anyone in opposition? Seeing none, the motion passes. Tony?
I just want to note to the board that we just approved an addendum. It is November 7th today, and our meeting is at the end of January, which means we are going to have a very tight timeline with the holidays to get these public hearings done. Please consider having joint hearings with your neighbors, maybe a webinar hearing, and responding to Emily as quickly as possible so that we can get the notice out to the public and have these hearings on the addendum. And Bob now has information when we're done.
All right, is there any other business to bring before this board? Seeing none, we'll seek a motion to adjourn. All right, and then Bob will turn it over to you.